On August 9, 1945, a man walked into his office and began describing the end of the world. He told his supervisor about a single bomb that had erased an entire city 3 days earlier. He described the white light, the silence that came after, the river he had to swim through to get home. His supervisor stared at him and called him crazy. And at that exact moment, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the room filled with the same white light, the same man, the same blinding flash, the second atomic bomb. His name was Tsutomu Yamaguchi, and this is the most extraordinary survival story in human history. But here is what nobody tells you. Surviving wasn't the hardest part. What came after, the 6 decades that followed, that is the part that will stay with you. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was born on March 16, 1916 in Nagasaki, Japan. He was a quiet, methodical marine engineer, a draftsman who spent his career at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries designing oil tankers. He opposed Japan's entry into World War II from the beginning. As the war dragged on and defeat seemed increasingly likely, his despair deepened to the point where he considered what the Japanese called an honored death, killing his wife Hisako and their infant son Katsutoshi with sleeping pills rather than let them face what might come if Japan lost. He never carried it out, but the fact that he considered it tells you everything about the psychological landscape of Japan in the summer of 1945. That summer, Mitsubishi sent Yamaguchi and 2 colleagues, Akira Iwanaga and Kuniyoshi Sato, on a 3-month business trip to Hiroshima to complete the design of a new oil tanker. August 6, 1945 was supposed to be his last day there. He was heading to the train station that morning, suitcase in hand, looking forward to going home to his wife and infant son in Nagasaki. But he had forgotten his hanko, the personal identification stamp that Japanese workers used for official documents. So he turned around and walked back to the office to get it. That single, forgettable decision placed him exactly 3 kilometers, just under 2 miles from the center of the most destructive moment in the history of modern warfare. At 8:15 in the morning, Yamaguchi was walking toward the Mitsubishi shipyard when he heard an aircraft overhead. He looked up and saw the American B-29 bomber Enola Gay flying high above the city. He watched it release a small object attached to 2 parachutes, drifting downward. Drawing on his naval air raid training, he threw himself to the ground, rolled into the nearest irrigation ditch, covered his eyes with his hands, and jammed his thumbs into his ears. 1 second later, the sky erupted in what he later described as the lightning of a huge magnesium flare. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, detonated at an altitude of 580 meters with the force of approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. The temperature at ground level exceeded 7,000 degrees Celsius in less than a second, hot enough to vaporize human beings within half a mile of ground zero. The blast wave expanded outward at nearly 1,000 miles per hour, flattening buildings across 2/3 of the city. Approximately 70,000 people died instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll would reach 140,000. Nuclear shadows, the permanent silhouettes of human beings burned into stone walls, were all that remained of some of the people who had been standing nearby. The shockwave hurled Yamaguchi through the air and sent him spinning into a nearby potato field. Both his eardrums ruptured from the pressure. He was temporarily blinded. Serious burns covered the left side of the upper half of his body. When he opened his eyes, the city he had worked in for 3 months had been replaced by a flat, burning, silent landscape stretching in every direction. He was 3 kilometers from where the bomb had detonated. By every reasonable measure, he should have been dead. What happened next is something most history books skip entirely. Yamaguchi didn't just survive the explosion. He then had to walk out of it. With ruptured eardrums, burned skin, and eyes still struggling to adjust, he stumbled toward what remained of the Mitsubishi shipyard, where he found his 2 colleagues, Iwanaga and Sato, both alive. The 3 of them spent that first night sheltering in an air raid bunker, surrounded by a city that was still burning. The next morning, they set out through streets that no longer looked like streets. At one river crossing, the bridge had been destroyed. Yamaguchi swam across. He later said there were bodies under the bridge, bobbing in the water like blocks of wood. He boarded a train packed with burned, barely conscious survivors. Some of them did not survive the journey, and he rode through the night, heading home. He arrived in Nagasaki on August 8th. His own doctor, a former school classmate, did not recognize him at first. His mother thought he was a ghost. His family struggled to recognize him at all. His burns were severe. He was running a high fever. His bandages needed changing, but there was almost nothing left to use. Any rational person would have stayed in bed for weeks. Yamaguchi reported for work the next morning. Think about that for a moment. 3 days after surviving an atomic bomb, still burned, barely able to hear, fighting the early symptoms of radiation poisoning, he went to work, because to him, ordinary life was the only thing worth fighting to return to. He didn't know that ordinary life was about to be taken from him a second time. August 9, 1945. Yamaguchi sat in the Mitsubishi offices in Nagasaki, heavily bandaged, and began telling his supervisor what had happened in Hiroshima. He described the white light, the single bomb, the city gone in a moment. His supervisor leaned back and told him he was crazy. "You're an engineer," he said. "How could one bomb possibly destroy a whole city?" Yamaguchi opened his mouth to answer. At that exact moment, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the windows on every side of the room exploded inward. The ceiling shook, and the room filled with the same white light Yamaguchi had seen 3 days earlier in Hiroshima, 300 kilometers away. The second bomb, Fat Man, a plutonium device more powerful than the first, carrying the force of 21,000 tons of TNT, was dropped by the American bomber Boxcar and detonated over the Urakami Valley, 3 kilometers from the Mitsubishi shipyard where Yamaguchi was sitting. In Hiroshima, he had been in open air with nothing between him and the blast. In Nagasaki, the city's hilly geography absorbed part of the shockwaves before it reached the building. That accident of terrain is almost certainly the only reason he survived a second time. But here is the detail that most people have never heard. His colleagues in that office, having just listened to his story seconds before the bomb hit, instinctively hit the floor the same way Yamaguchi had described doing in Hiroshima. His account of surviving the first bomb, delivered in the final moments before the second bomb detonated, may have saved the lives of the people sitting with him. Fat Man killed at least 40,000 people in Nagasaki instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll reached approximately 74,000. The city was devastated. Yamaguchi crawled out of the rubble for the second time in 3 days and ran home. He found his wife, Kisako, and son, Katsutoshi, alive. But Hisako had been outside when the bomb detonated and had been soaked by the black rain, the dark radioactive fallout that fell across Nagasaki in the aftermath. She had no way of knowing what it was. Nobody in Nagasaki fully understood yet what had just happened. She had simply been caught in the rain. In the weeks that followed, Yamaguchi lay at home with a raging fever, continuous vomiting, severe hair loss, and wounds that refused to heal. He was experiencing what doctors would later identify as acute radiation syndrome, the systematic destruction of the body's ability to repair itself. No physician in history had ever been asked to treat a patient exposed to 2 separate atomic blasts within 3 days. There was no protocol. There was no precedent. There was simply a man in a room, willing himself to keep going, and slowly over weeks, he began to recover. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The war was over. Yamaguchi returned to work. He served as a translator for the American occupation forces. He went back to teaching, then back to engineering at Mitsubishi. He and Hisako had 2 more daughters in the early 1950s. To the outside world, he had survived and moved on. But here is what most people do not know. In Japan, survivors of the atomic bombings are known as hibakusha, literally explosion-affected people. For decades after the war, hibakusha faced widespread discrimination across Japanese society. Many could not find work. Many could not find marriage partners because of fears largely unfounded, as research would later confirm that radiation damage might be passed to children. Survivors were told, "Don't come close, you're infectious." They were asked to hide what they were. 24% of hibakusha surveyed in the 1980s said they had concealed their identity to avoid discrimination. Yamaguchi kept his story almost entirely private for decades, partly because of this. He dealt with what he had witnessed by writing tanka, a traditional form of Japanese poetry, quiet, precise, devastating poems about fire and water and the people he had watched die. a University of Virginia historian who visited Yamaguchi at his home in Nagasaki in 2008, described watching him recite his own poems and seeing him, even then, 60 years later, stop mid-recitation and be unable to continue. The memories were still there, completely intact, and the bombs had never stopped taking things from him. He developed leukemia, then cataracts. His burns caused him chronic pain for the rest of his life. His son Katsutoshi, the infant he had been so desperate to return to on the morning of August 6th, struggled with serious health problems his entire life and died in 2005 at the age of 59. His cause of death was cancer. And then in 2008, Yamaguchi's wife Hisako, the woman who had been soaked by the black rain in Nagasaki 63 years earlier, died of kidney and liver cancer. She was 88 years old. The rain that had fallen on her on August 9, 1945, had been quietly, patiently working inside her body for 6 decades. Tsutomu Yamaguchi had survived 2 atomic bombs. He had outlived the war. He had rebuilt his life, raised his children, grown old, and the bombs had still taken his son and his wife, not in the explosion, not in the fire. 60 years later, the bomb doesn't stop when the mushroom cloud disappears. It keeps going. It keeps taking. Long after the world has moved on, it is still there, in the blood, in the cells, in the slow unraveling of the people who happened to be standing nearby on an ordinary morning when the sky turned white. In his 80s, something shifted in Yamaguchi. He'd spent most of his life carrying what he knew in silence. But now he decided that silence was no longer something he could afford. He wrote a memoir. He gave interviews. In 2006, at the age of 90, he was part of a documentary about the 165 people known to have been caught in both bombings, a film called Twice Survived, which was screened at the United Nations. At the screening, he stood before the representatives of the world and said, "Having experienced atomic bombings twice and survived, it is my destiny to talk about it." In January 2009, Yamaguchi formally applied to the Japanese government for official recognition as a Naiju Hebakusha, a double explosion-affected person. In March 2009, the government accepted. He became the only person in history officially recognized by any government as having survived both atomic bombings. "My double radiation exposure is now an official government record," he said. "It can tell the younger generation the horrifying history of the atomic bombings even after I die." On December 22, 2009, Canadian filmmaker James Cameron and author Charles Pellegrino visited Yamaguchi in hospital in Nagasaki. They discussed nuclear weapons, memory, and what the world owed to the people who had lived through this. Before they left, Yamaguchi looked at them and said, "I think it is Cameron's and Pellegrino's destiny to make a film about nuclear weapons. That film has not been made." On January 4, 2010, Tsutomu Yamaguchi died of stomach cancer. He was 93 years old. In his later years, Yamaguchi was asked many times what he wanted the world to understand. He never gave a complicated answer. He said, "The reason that I hate the atomic bomb is because of what it does to the dignity of human beings, not the blast radius, not the body count, not the political arguments about whether it was necessary. The dignity, what it means to survive something designed to make survival impossible. What it costs a person, over months, over years, over 6 decades of slow, quiet loss, to carry the weight of having been there." Tsutomu Yamaguchi spent his final years asking one question, not angrily, not politically, quietly. He said, "I can't understand why the world cannot understand the agony of the nuclear bombs. How can they keep developing these weapons?" He died without an answer. The question is still there, waiting.